One outdated internal system nearly took down one of the largest airlines in America, and almost nobody outside the company saw it coming until it was too late. This is the story of how a piece of scheduling software that had quietly worked well enough for years turned into the single reason a major airline collapsed for an entire week, right in the middle of the busiest travel season of the year. If you manage people, budgets, or systems of any kind, this is the story you need to hear, because the failure was not really about airplanes. It was about what happens when an organization keeps postponing an unglamorous investment because everything still seems to be working. Let's set the scene. In December 2022, a severe winter storm swept across the United States. This was not a small regional weather event. It disrupted flights at nearly every major airline in the country. Runways iced over, crews got delayed, connections were missed, and for a day or two, chaos was everywhere. That part is completely normal. Airlines deal with weather disruptions constantly, and most of them have built processes to absorb the shock and recover quickly. That resilience does not happen by accident. It requires deliberate investment in buffer capacity, backup staffing plans, and systems flexible enough to adapt when the unexpected happens. Most of the time, nobody notices that investment because nothing goes wrong. It only becomes visible in hindsight when one company handles a crisis smoothly and another one does not, and everyone starts asking why the difference was so stark. And that is exactly what happened almost everywhere else. Most carriers recovered within a couple of days. Flights cancelled on day 1 were largely back on schedule by day 3. Crews were reassigned, planes were repositioned, and passengers, while frustrated, mostly made it to where they needed to go within a reasonable window. Southwest did not. While its competitors were stabilizing, Southwest's situation kept getting worse. Cancellations piled on top of cancellations. By the time the dust settled, the airline had cancelled more than 16,000 flights over about a week. 16,000 flights. Passengers were stranded in airports for days. Crew members were stuck away from home during the holidays, unable to get back to their bases. It became one of the most visible operational meltdowns in the history of the airline industry, playing out in real time on social media, in news broadcasts, and in the frustrated voices of stranded travelers everywhere. So, what actually went wrong? It wasn't the storm itself. Every airline faced the same weather. The difference was what happened after the weather hit. Investigators later pointed to Southwest's crew scheduling software as the root cause. This is the internal system responsible for tracking which pilots and flight attendants are available, which aircraft they're assigned to, and how to reassign everyone when the original plan falls apart. Under normal conditions, this system worked fine. It had been running for years, quietly doing its job in the background, mostly invisible to anyone outside of operations. But it had not been meaningfully modernized in years, despite repeated internal warnings that it was fragile and outdated. Here's the part worth sitting with for a moment. Internal warnings existed. This wasn't a total surprise, a bolt out of the blue that nobody could have predicted. People inside the company had flagged the risk, and yet the system stayed in place because it worked well enough, day to day, under normal conditions. That phrase, well enough under normal conditions, is doing a lot of quiet damage in a lot of organizations right now. It's worth remembering the next time you're tempted to deprioritize a boring infrastructure fix in favor of something flashier. Let's talk about the mechanism, because this actually explains why the meltdown snowballed instead of resolving itself. When the storm caused mass disruptions, thousands of flights needed to be reshuffled at once. Crews had to be reassigned to different aircraft, different routes, different timing. This is an enormously complex logistics problem even in the best of circumstances. Think of it like a giant, constantly shifting puzzle. Every pilot has flight hour limits. Every flight attendant has a home base they eventually need to return to. Every aircraft has a maintenance schedule. And all of these constraints change by the minute as delays cascade through the system. A useful way to picture this is a giant game of musical chairs. Except the number of chairs, the number of players, and the rules for who can sit where are all changing simultaneously, several times a minute, for days on end. Humans cannot track that kind of complexity by memory or by spreadsheet. That's precisely why airlines, banks, hospitals, and other large operations build specialized software for exactly this kind of real-time matching problem in the first place. The whole point of the system is to do, in seconds, what a room full of people with phones and clipboards could never do fast enough. A modern scheduling system is built to solve exactly this kind of puzzle automatically, quickly reassigning available staff to available flights as conditions change. Southwest's system could not do that. It could not efficiently reassign crews to available aircraft at the speed and scale the situation demanded. And here's the truly maddening part. The people needed to keep the airline running were often right there. Pilots and flight attendants were technically available and willing to fly. They wanted to work. The problem was not a staffing shortage in the traditional sense. The problem was that the software could not match available people to open flights fast enough. So what did Southwest do instead? Staff had to fall back on manual phone calls, one by one, just to figure out who was where, who was available, and who could be slotted into which flight. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle with thousands of moving pieces by calling each piece individually on the phone to ask where it currently is. That is not an exaggeration of what was happening. It is essentially a description of the actual process. A task that a properly functioning system should have handled programmatically in seconds was instead handled by exhausted staff on telephones, one call at a time, for days. And because that process could not keep pace with the scale of the disruption, the backlog didn't shrink. It grew. Each hour that passed without resolving the mismatch between available staff and open flights added more cancellations. More cancellations created more schedule chaos. More chaos required more manual untangling. That took more time, which created more cancellations. This is a feedback loop. And feedback loops are dangerous precisely because they don't need new problems to keep getting worse. They just need time and an unwilling to cooperate system. That's why the backlog snowballed for days, well after the weather itself had cleared. Think about that detail carefully, because it's the single most important fact in this whole story. The storm passed, the skies cleared, runways were fine, and Southwest was still cancelling thousands of flights. Days later, because the operational system underneath the airline could not catch up. The weather was the trigger. The scheduling software was the actual cause of the extended crisis. Now let's talk about what happened afterward, because the consequences extended well beyond a bad week of flight delays. Congress held hearings on the meltdown. When a private company's internal software failure causes a national news story and strands tens of thousands of travelers over the holidays, it becomes a matter of public interest, not just an internal operational hiccup. Executives had to explain, on the record, in front of lawmakers, why an internal IT system was allowed to become this fragile. That kind of public scrutiny changes the calculus completely. A quiet software fix, handled internally on a normal timeline, never makes headlines and never requires anyone to testify in front of lawmakers. A crisis-driven fix does both. The same underlying problem, addressed a year earlier, might have cost a fraction of the money and none of the political exposure. Once regulators and elected officials get involved, the cost of a fix stops being purely a business decision and becomes a matter of public record, scrutinized indefinitely. Southwest also faced a significant financial penalty as a result of the meltdown. Beyond the direct cost of refunds, rebooking, and compensation to stranded passengers, there was a formal financial consequence tied to how the airline had handled the situation. And on top of the financial penalty came something that's often harder to repair: lasting reputational damage. Southwest had built its brand for decades around reliability and customer friendliness. That meltdown became one of the defining stories associated with the airline, a story that outlived the actual week it happened in, resurfacing any time the topic of airline reliability comes up. In response, the airline committed hundreds of millions of dollars to updating its operational technology. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Think about that figure for a second, and compare it to what a proactive software modernization project might have cost years earlier, before the crisis, on a calm Tuesday with no storm in sight and no cameras pointed at the company. It's a near certainty that a planned, careful upgrade completed in normal conditions would have cost a fraction of what the company ended up spending in the aftermath of a public crisis, on top of the reputational cost that money alone can't buy back. Now, Here's the part that most people telling this story skip past, and it's the part that actually matters most if you're the one making budget decisions inside an organization. It's tempting to look at Southwest and think this is a story about one company that got unlucky, or one team that made a bad call about a piece of software years ago. That framing lets everyone else off the hook. But here's the part nobody expects. This exact pattern, an old, good enough back-end system, quietly carrying enormous operational risk, is sitting inside almost every organization right now, in some form. And most leadership teams have no idea it's there until the exact wrong moment forces them to find out. Think about your own organization for a second. Is there a piece of internal software, a spreadsheet-based process, a scheduling tool, a database, something that just works day to day, that somebody flagged as fragile a while back, and that never got prioritized because there was always something more urgent on the roadmap? That's not a hypothetical question. In most organizations, the honest answer is yes, and often more than one system fits that description. Here's my own take on this, and it's a little more pointed than the standard invest in infrastructure advice you usually hear. The real failure at Southwest wasn't really a technology failure. It was a governance failure, a failure of prioritization. Somebody, somewhere, decided year after year that other projects mattered more than fixing a system that internal people had already flagged as risky. That is a decision made by humans, repeatedly, not a surprise inflicted on the company by fate. Blaming outdated technology lets the actual decision-makers off the hook a little too easily. The technology didn't decide to stay outdated. People decided not to fund replacing it. There's a useful comparison here to technical debt, a concept familiar to anyone who has worked around software teams. Just like financial debt, technical debt accrues interest. A shortcut or an outdated system that saves money today keeps quietly costing more every year it isn't addressed, because the gap between what the system can handle and what the business actually needs keeps widening. Eventually, the interest payments come due all at once, usually at the worst possible time, and the total bill is far larger than if the debt had been paid down early. This is where the core lesson extends far beyond airlines and far beyond scheduling software specifically. Every organization has back-end systems, the kind of infrastructure that quietly works during normal conditions and never shows up in a highlight reel. Payroll systems, inventory databases, customer service ticketing tools, internal approval workflows, customer databases, security patching processes, the onboarding checklist that only one person on the team fully understands. None of these show up in a strategy deck, and none of them get applause when they work correctly, which is exactly the problem. A functioning back-end system is invisible by design, the same way a healthy immune system is invisible until the day the body actually gets sick. None of these are exciting. None of them win awards. And that is exactly why they're dangerous to neglect, because nobody feels urgency about fixing something that isn't currently on fire. But these systems share one property that makes them uniquely risky. They tend to fail or reveal their weaknesses exactly when a company can least afford it. Not on a quiet Tuesday with plenty of slack in the schedule, during peak demand, during a crisis, during the exact moment when everything else is already under maximum stress, and there is zero margin for a back-end failure to make things worse. A scheduling system that struggles under a small amount of above-normal load might function fine for years because that load rarely happens. Then a storm hits, demand spikes, and the one weak point in the whole operation becomes the deciding factor in how the entire company performs under pressure. That's the core insight for any manager listening to this. Investing in unglamorous infrastructure before it breaks is far cheaper than rebuilding trust and paying penalties after it does. That's not a moral platitude. It's a direct, practical comparison of costs. The cost of proactive maintenance is a line item you control, on a schedule you choose, at a scale you can plan for. The cost of reactive crisis repair includes emergency spending, regulatory penalties, executives testifying in hearings, customers who switch to competitors, and a brand story that follows the company for years. One of these costs is predictable and manageable. The other one is not. So here's a practical way to think about applying this in your own role, whatever kind of organization you're in. Somewhere in your operation, there is very likely a system that people already know is fragile, It might not be software. It could be a single person who holds too much undocumented knowledge, a process that only works because one specific employee remembers all the exceptions, a vendor relationship with no backup plan, or a piece of infrastructure that was built for a scale the company has since outgrown. One simple exercise borrowed from risk management can help surface these blind spots before a crisis does it for you. Imagine, right now, that your busiest possible day happens tomorrow, the equivalent of your own December storm. Walk through your operation and ask which system would be the first to buckle under that kind of pressure. Ask who has already raised concerns about that system and what happened to those concerns afterward. If the honest answer is that the concerns were logged somewhere and never acted on, you have just found your own version of Southwest's scheduling software. The value of this exercise isn't that it eliminates risk entirely, because no organization can eliminate all operational risk. The value is that it turns an invisible, easy-to-ignore risk into a visible, budgeted line item that leadership has consciously chosen to accept or fix, rather than a risk nobody chose to look at until it was too late. The Southwest story gives you a very specific signal to watch for. If internal people have already raised concerns about a system, and those concerns were noted but not acted on, that is not a closed issue. That is an open risk sitting on the books, quietly accumulating interest. More real case studies like this follow along. So here's the practical takeaway, and it circles right back to where we started. One outdated internal system nearly broke Southwest Airlines, not because nobody saw the risk coming, but because the risk was seen and then deprioritized again and again until a storm made the deprioritization impossible to ignore. If a system in your organization only gets attention when it fails, that itself is the warning sign worth escalating. And it's worth escalating long before the next storm hits, not after. Don't wait for your own December 2022. Find the system everyone quietly agrees is fragile and put it on the roadmap before the weather forces your hand.